Thank the gentleman. Now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Gowdy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to read a regulation. I would ask all the panelists to pay attention. It's a little tedious, but it's important. If new or unanticipated threats or hazards are discovered by either the government or the contractor, or if existing safeguards have ceased to function, the discoverer shall immediately bring the situation to the attention of the other party. That's a regulation. Mr. Hess, Mr. Giannetta, were there also contractual obligations in this realm between you and the government?
There are.
And they would be what? Similar to that? A notice provision?
I don't have an immediate recollection of the exact text, but it is similarly worded.
Okay. I think it's helpful sometimes to define terms, particularly for those of us that are liberal arts majors and don't deal with this. What is a new or unanticipated threat or hazard? Mr. Hess?
That would be an indication of compromise of a system or a failure of any of the system protections.
Oh, so when Chairman Chaffetz was having a difficult time getting answered to that question because the focus was on the loss of personal information, that's really not what that phrase means. It's just a threat or hazard. It doesn't actually have to be a loss, does it?
Not the way that I would define it.
Me either. What about existing safeguards have ceased to function? What does that mean? Mr. Hess?
Sir, it's pretty explanatory.
It did strike me as being self-explanatory. It did. Mr. Giannetta, is it self-explanatory to you? Existing safeguards have ceased to function?
Yes.
Now, here's the really tough question, and I'll let both of you weigh in on this one because it is tough. What does the word immediately mean?
Without delay.
Without delay. Mr. Giannetta, is there another meaning that you're familiar with?
I think that's a good definition.
All right, so you had both a contractual obligation with the government and there's a regulatory obligation that if new or unanticipated threats or hazards are discovered by either the government or the contractor, or if existing safeguards have ceased to function, the discoverer shall immediately bring the situation to the attention of the other party. Ms. Archuleta, I had heard this morning about a March 2014 data breach. Did I hear that right?
Yes, sir, you did.
And when did you bring that breach to the attention of either Mr. Hess or Mr. Giannetta? And you are welcome to turn on your microphone or else bring it closer to you.
I would have to get that information back to you. I don't have it in my notes. Perhaps Ms. Seymour would know, but if not, we'd get that information back to you.
Well, do you know if it was immediately?
I would expect that it was immediate.
Well, let's find out. Ms. Seymour, do you know?
No, sir, I don't, but I don't think that I certainly don't think that we immediately notified our contractors of a breach to our network because at that time we did not have any question as to whether it was affecting them. It was to our network at that time.
Mr. Hess, Mr. Giannetta, is that your understanding that they were under no duty to bring that to your attention? Not all at once. It's your contractual language, and you're looking at the regulation. Do you think you should have been notified because of the March breach?
Absolutely.
Well, why? Because I just heard one person say she didn't know, and another say it was really none of your business. So why should you have been notified, despite the plain language of the regulation and the contractual language? Why do you think it was important that you be notified?
So that we could take appropriate or more appropriate actions to protect data.
Were you notified?
I was not.
Were you notified immediately?
No.
Huh. What do you have to say about that, Ms. Seymour?
I believe that that's accurate, sir.
Well, I'm with you there. I guess my question is why? Why, despite the plain language of the contract and the plain language of the regulation, why did you not immediately notify the contractors?
We worked with DHS and partners and to understand the potential compromise to our system so that we could make proper notifications.
Was DHS one of your contractors?
No, sir.
Well, I didn't think so, which that doesn't really help me understand the regulation because it says contractor. It doesn't say DHS. So why didn't you notify the contractor?
At that time, we were still investigating what had happened in our network
What does the word immediately mean to you?
without undue.
Did you do so?
No, sir, we did not.
Does the regulation say as soon as you figure out what happened or after you talk to DHS? That is not in my version of the regulation. Is it in yours?
I have not read that regulation, sir.
No, you know why you haven't? Because that one doesn't exist. The one that says notify DHS or try to figure it out. The only one that exists says to immediately notify the contractor, and you're telling me you didn't do it, and my question is why?
I can't answer that question.
Who can?
I will take that back and get you.
To whom will you take it?
I believe I would take it back to my staff to see if we have processes in place.
Do you think it's
that we can
staff's
do that.
responsibility to notify the contractor?
We have processes in place for making notifications when we find these.
Who's ultimately responsible for that process? Who failed to meet the contractual and regulatory obligations?
I would have to read that regulation, sir. I'm not familiar with it.
I just read it.
I'd be happy to read it, and I'd like to read the full context of it.
Oh, you think the context is different from what I just read?
I would want to read the context.
How about the contract? Have you read the
that we have.
contract?
I have read most of the parts of the contract, sir.
Well, I can't speak for the chairman, but my guess is that he and the other members would be really interested in who failed to honor both the letter and the spirit of the contractual obligation and the regulatory obligation. With that, I would yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Will now recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bob, can you describe the process of a partial birth abortion so people will have a better understanding of why it might have been banned, and they may actually have a better understanding of why Professor Smith would have argued against that ban?
Yes, a partial birth abortion as defined under federal law is where a physician partially delivers, usually the trunk and legs of the baby, leaving only the head in the birth canal, and the baby is alive, and then takes an act to kill the baby at that point, usually thrusting scissors into the back of the skull in order to kill the baby, and then completes the delivery. So it's a way of killing the baby when most of the baby is already outside of the womb.
And there were actually people who argued against banning that barbaric practice?
Oh yes. I mean, many of the people we've been hearing from today were big advocates for a continuation of partial birth abortions. They have no respect for human life if they consider it to be unborn or they want to label it as a fetus. And literally anything is all right as far as they seem to be concerned.
Well, let's go to that point because Professor Smith seems to draw a line, artificial as it may be, between the humanity owed to a viable fetus and the lack of humanity owed to what she considers to be a non-viable fetus. Who gets to draw that line of demarcation between viability and non-viability?
Well, that's a complex question. Number one, it is a medical determination on whether or not a child is viable, but it's a difficult one, and there are many gray areas. For instance, the statistics are after 20 weeks, 1 in 4 can survive. And we would consider that to mean, therefore, that anyone born at that point in time ought to be considered viable. But many times you just simply don't know until later. I haven't heard any people that work at abortion clinics are able to make that fine and complex medical decision.
No, I think Professor Smith, if I heard her correctly, said that she was not a doctor and it should be up to the doctors to make that determination. Although I did note the irony, it was 9 damn lawyers who came up with that plan, not of one of whom was a doctor. And I also noted the irony of Hank Johnson wondering why there weren't more women on our side of the aisle when they tend to target those who seek office as Republican women. And there wasn't a single woman on the court when Roe versus Wade was decided, but that doesn't seem to trouble him much either for those watching at home or here, doesn't civil law recognize the viability of even a pre-viable fetus when it comes time for the plaintiff's attorney to get paid?
There are many instances of cases in various states of wrongful death of the unborn, of criminal laws to punish.
Well, we're going to get to the criminal law in a second. Let's just stick with civil right now. When it comes time for the trial attorney to get paid, we have a different definition of viability, right?
Well, viability is simply not relevant.
Exactly. You can
know.
be 2 weeks pregnant, and you have a cause of action on behalf of that unborn child. And our friends on the other side of the aisle, some of whom were plaintiffs' attorneys, have no trouble being paid for the life of that 2-week-old.
Right. The idea of separating, using viability as a standard is really antiquated, and most courts have gone away from that to just simply the point that if the child is alive.
Well, but it's hard to go away from viability when Professor Smith said there's not any humanity owed a pre-viable, she won't say baby, pre-viable fetus.
That's exactly.
Did I misunderstand her? Is there any degree of humanity owed?
Well,
I mean, you've been sitting beside her all morning. Did I miss something? Is there something outside the bounds of decency we really won't allow as long as the fetus is pre-viable?
well, as I understand her testimony, if a born alive infant is considered to be not viable, then we have a free fire zone. We can do whatever we want. We can kill the life at will, harvest their tissues, whatever the case may be. And of course, the concern about the producing intact infants, which it has been demonstrated in the videos, is of course the possibility that these unborn children are alive. And there's even evidence that one of the intact babies born alive had a beating heart, which is a definition of being alive.
Which is why the videos are relevant to our conversation about partial birth abortion. Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time. I just have 2 really quick questions for Ms. Smith, which she can answer with a yes or no. Ms. Smith, if we were to double the amount of money available to the providers but give it to someone not named Planned Parenthood, would you be okay with that?
I would have to know who it was going to and whether they were qualified.
Anyone not named Planned Parenthood?
Not anyone, no.
Anyone who's qualified to provide services.
If they provide high-quality services to low-income people in the same way that Planned Parenthood does, frankly, yes. I don't have
So
any
you're okay with us
interest.
defunding Planned Parenthood as long as the money goes somewhere where it can do the most amount of good for the same group of people?
Yes.
You're okay with Congress defunding Planned Parenthood?
Not in the current environment where there is no one able
And if
to
there
pick
were,
that
would you
what.
be okay with
If
it?
there were, yeah, it would be a different world, and yes, then you could fund that organization.
So if we can identify
those
service
services.
providers that meet that same quality of care, not named Planned Parenthood, you'll support the Republicans in defunding Planned Parenthood?
I don't know that you and I will agree on who those people are, and I would have to.
Sure. How about we just try? How about, why don't we do
Theoretically,
that?
If you're asking me a hypothetical question, there was.
Yeah, I'll double the money as long as
that
it
has-
doesn't go to the folks who donate money to Democrats' Planned Parenthood. We'll double the
What
amount of
about-
money available as long as it doesn't go to Planned Parenthood. How's that?
As long as it doesn't go to Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood today is the institution that provides the best, highest quality care to women in this country, across this nation, in cities, in low-income areas where these services are unavailable to them.
They're also the
otherwise.
target of videos that are barbaric
and
and heinous and subhuman.
They're-
So as long as we can get that same level of care and
They
do it to an
provide
entity not
abortion
named
as
Planned
a
Parenthood,
very small part of their services, and this is why you oppose them, and that is the only reason you oppose them.
you have
They
no
didn't-
idea why. I was voting to defund Planned Parenthood, with all due respect, Professor, before the videos ever showed up.
I wasn't talking about the videos.
Well, I don't think we know each other well enough for you to
Probably
assign a
not.
motive to what I'm